Hey, good morning, everybody. We still have some folks, looks like, still joining here, so we're going to wait a few more minutes, and then we'll get started here shortly. Okay, well, hello, everybody. Welcome to the 2020 NMAC Fall Conference. Although this is the first time that I know of that NMAC is doing this online completely in NMAC's history, I hope that this conference provides us some semblance of normalcy in these unique times. I'm happy that we were able to organize a conference during a pandemic, and it demonstrates the resiliency of the organization. So thank you all for attending today and continuing to support NMAC. The topic for this year's conference is the Pithouse to Pueblo transition. This social and demographic transition was gradual, covered hundreds of years and hundreds of miles across the Southwest, and it represented a modification of adaptive strategies by Pithouse agriculturalists. This transition occurred in distinct ways in various regions and was not uniformly adopted. There have been several published articles, volumes, and symposia at national and local conferences that have covered this topic. I always think of Whalen's cultural ecological aspects, foundations, crucible, those kinds of things. This conference ties together recent research into the lives of various Southwestern groups during this transitional period. The following presentations will cover a large geographic area from the Four Corners to Albuquerque Basin, down to Memories, and even over to the Verde Valley in Arizona. And they cover various topics related to architecture, ceramic production, lithic technology, turkey diet, and unique dating techniques, representing a sample of the early formative period in the Southwest. So this is hosted on Zoom as a webinar, of course, and you are able to come and go as you please today, if needed. Just follow the link that was sent to you via email, and you can rejoin at any time if you need to leave for a bit. We're going to accept questions today, but in groups. So the conference is organized into 3 different groups of 3 presentations. There's 9 presentations total. So after each presentation group is a short break or a lunch. And at the end of each group's presentations, basically after the 3rd presentation in that group, we will allow some time for questions. You can use the Q&A function through the Zoom application, which should be at the bottom of your screen. So you can ask questions at any time, even during the presentations. You don't need to save them for the reserved Q&A time. However, they won't be answered until the end of the 3rd presentation for each group. Though this conference is not scheduled to run for a full day, HPD has graciously allowed the conference to count towards a full 8 hours of continuing education credits for us who are in attendance today and registered. So the email address that was associated with online conference registration will receive an attendance certificate. And although credits are not required for 2020 because of COVID-19, these credits obtained today can be applied to the next time that your permit needs to be renewed. So before we get started, our current NMAC president, Teresa Hurt, will provide an update on NMAC for 2020 and 2021. And following her will be a quick lesson on the conference webinar from Jennifer Rideout, who's our technical expert today, who's basically pulling the digital strings backstage, and she'll walk us through how the webinar will proceed today. Teresa?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here and for your support of NMAC. Thanks so much, Kai, for going above and beyond and fulfilling the traditional duties of past president this year and organizing this conference, despite all the challenges of working during the COVID pandemic. I'd also like to say a big thank you to Jennifer Rideout of SWCA's IT department. Jen is our Zoom webinar expert, and she set up this virtual conference for us. And she will be facilitating this meeting in the background all day. Jen will explain the various functions of the webinar platform for us in just a little bit. And Jen, I'll make sure you get your continuing education certificate for having to listen to this all day long. Thanks to all of the NMAC board members and committee chairs and co-chairs who volunteered their time this year, keeping our website and listserv functioning, administering the grants program, producing our publications and newsletter, tracking important legislative developments, planning conferences and workshops, and keeping our finances in the black. And finally, thank you to all of our presenters today for the awesome papers we're about to hear. This has been a hanging in there kind of year for NMAC when we've adjusted to doing everything virtually. Mike Spears took care of adding most of our old library of NewsMac issues to the website. And NewsMac editor Tamara Yeager-Stewart will be getting out a fall issue this month. Cherie Wolf produced and distributed the annual volume from our 2018 fall conference. The website is functioning well for online membership and conference registration and purchases of our publications. Bill Leckman sent out the call for grant applications this fall, and Paul Reed kept an eye on legislative issues this year and drafted a comment letter on behalf of NMAC on the Farmington-Mancos Gallup Draft Resource Management Plan Amendment and Environmental Impact Statement. Adoption of this planning document could have a big effect on the cultural landscape of the greater Chaco region. So I think it was important that we got that comment out, and thank you, Paul, for putting that together. Our workshops committee expanded this year to include Robin Cordero, Bob Estes, Laura Wallace, Jeff Verdeen, and Chair Dave Kirkpatrick. Committee members coordinated with Historic Preservation Division staff to plan and present a virtual built environment workshop later this year, and also did some planning for additional workshops related to drone technology and ceramic analysis. But we've postponed events that really need to be hands-on and in person. I think that NMAC as an organization should be proud that we're actually holding this conference today, given that many other professional associations have decided to table their conferences and other annual events until next year. The New Mexico HPD has confirmed that you'll receive a full day of continuing ed credits for attendance today. And in addition to this conference, an abbreviated version of our annual Historic Built Environment Workshop will be presented by HPD staff on December 3rd. Check for an email from this past week for the announcement from Michelle Incy about this workshop. You can also find the workshop registration information on NMAC's website. Because both of these annual events are being presented virtually this year, the board decided to waive the usual attendance fees. So in the past, these events have been important revenue sources for NMAC that made it possible for us to fund our grant program, to provide publications, such as the annual conference volume. Nevertheless, because so many of you have continued to support NMAC by renewing your membership this year or joining for the first time, we still finished 2020 with a small net income. And if you're interested in reviewing our treasurer's report, just ask Bill Whitehead to email you a copy. And Bill's contact information is on the NMAC website. Thanks for crunching the numbers again this year, Bill. And thanks also to our webmaster, Mike Spears, for setting up and maintaining our online payment system on the website. For those of you joining us today who may not have joined NMAC or haven't renewed your membership yet, it's not too late to do that after the conference. If you sign up afterward and provide your contact information, Bill will see to it that you receive your continuing ed certificate for your attendance today. We didn't suffer any vacancies this past year, and we had a full slate of officers and committee members. And we also recently added 2 new positions to the NMAC Executive Committee. Following our 3rd quarterly board meeting in August, we voted to add the New Mexico State Archaeologist and the Site Watch Coordinator as ex officio members of the board. And we're looking forward to enhanced communication and collaboration among NMAC, HPD, and New Mexico Site Watch in 2021. Thank you, Michelle Ency and Jessica Bodner, for joining us and agreeing to add at least 4 more Zoom meetings to your lives for next year. I hope many of you will continue to serve in 2021, but I also urge others from the membership to consider volunteering your time next year and throwing your hat in the ring for a board or committee position. I'm looking forward to a peaceful transition of power with no legal challenges sent to the Supreme Court as I pass on the NMAC presidency to our president-elect for 2021, Megan Trowbridge. Thanks, Megan, for accepting the job. And now I'll turn you all over to Jen Rideout.
Awesome. Thank you, Teresa. So hello, my name is Jen Rideout, and as Teresa and Kai mentioned, I am your technical support for the webinar conference controls today. Just a couple quick notes for how you can definitely participate in today's conference. So before we dig in, just a quick reminder that everybody as an attendee has joined the webinar in a listen-only mode. That means that you don't have the ability to turn on or off your audio, and the interaction we have will be through the Q&A function, which I'll go through in just a minute. The available controls are located at the bottom of your screen. You'll see a chat option, a raise hand, and a Q&A. The chat function will be turned off for attendee chat, though please check there for important announcements regarding contact information for myself as an example, and just general reminders for the conference. The raise hand function, if you have issues or need assistance where you can't type into a question and answer box or anything like that, please feel free to raise your hand and we can allow you to ask questions verbally if that's the case, though the preference really is to submit via the Q&A option. And then there is that Q&A button on the right hand side. If you click that Q&A button, it's going to open up a screen where you can type questions. Let's go ahead and take a look at what that looks like now. So for example, asking questions, and these are going to be after the different groups of presentations we have. So right about at that morning break time, where you'll be able to ask questions and people will answer them based on what was submitted during the first round, and so on and so forth. To ask a written question, be sure to click that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You'll have a little pop-up window that comes up with a place for you to type your question. Once you start typing, you'll see a button that says to hit send. And then our speakers may choose to respond live to those questions, or they may choose to type back answers to you. So just be sure to check that from time to time, and you'll see at the top, once questions have been asked, that you'll have answered questions and outstanding questions available. To ask a verbal question, again, if you are unable to type in your question to the Q&A box, you can raise your hand. You can raise your hand again by clicking that raise hand icon at the bottom of your screen. Or if you are typing, if you've joined the conference as from a touch tone only phone, you'll be able to hit *9, and that will raise your hand on screen for us to see, and the moderator can call your name. Otherwise, if you have any questions or difficulty in working through the controls today, please contact me. I'll be off video and in the background, but you can call me on my cell phone. That's 208-874-7175. Or you can email me at jennifer.rideout@swca.com. And again, I'll put this in the chat as well. For those of you who are just joined by a touch-tone phone, that email address is jennifer.rideout@swca.com. And after that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it right back over to Kai Miller.
Thank you, Jen. Share my screen here. Somebody confirm for me that this is showing up here.
Confirmed.
Thank you very much. So the first presentation today I'll give, I wrote it with Harlan McCaffrey and Robert Tycott, and the title of our presentation is The Paleo Diet of Turkeys in the Early Pueblo Period of the Northern Southwest. So the domestication of turkey in the American Southwest has recently been a topic of substantial archaeological interest. Currently, the timing of turkey domestication in the northern Southwest is not well understood because wild turkeys are difficult to differentiate from domestic turkeys based on skeletal morphology alone. Stable isotope analysis is a method that researchers have extensively used to help understand when and where turkey domestication occurred. This analysis tests the amount of C4 plants in animals' diets. A fully C4 based diet has been interpreted as a clear indicator of close proximity to humans throughout a turkey's life. This paper presents the results of stable isotope analysis on a sample of turkey remains from 5 early Pueblo habitation sites in northwestern New Mexico and southwestern Colorado. The chronological periods represented by the samples in the study, which is going to be referred to as the early Pueblo period generally, ranges from AD 500 to about 1050. Previous stable isotope and coprolite studies indicated that turkeys consume primarily C4 over a long period of time, basically Basque Maker 3 through Pueblo 3, and in many locations, suggesting these animals were widely domesticated. However, while there's an abundance of data associated with later, basically post-AD 700 periods, the earlier evidence for C4 consumption by turkeys is limited to a relatively small sample. By roughly the 6th century AD, residents of the northern Southwest began living an increasingly sedentary lifestyle and becoming more reliant on agriculture as their primary subsistence strategy. New tools and crops were introduced to the northern Southwest, including trout patates and beans, and turkey is also found in the faunal assemblages of early Pueblo habitation sites during this period. So this study asked the question, when did turkeys transition from a wild animal to a domesticated animal in the northern Southwest? To our knowledge, the only evidence of turkeys predominantly consuming C4 plants, in other words, domesticated plants, likely representing maize, before the Basque Maker 3 period, AD 500, is turkey coprolites from a Basque Maker 2 context at the Turkey Pen site in southeast Utah. So this is a map that shows our study sample and the sites where we obtained them. Again, they were from 6 recorded archaeological sites representing 5 habitation sites, including San Brito Village and the Oven site in the San Juan River drainage, Tolokai Hamlet in the southern Chusca Valley, Bachili Village in the Puerco Valley, and LA 265, which is along the Santa Fe River about where it dumps in with the Rio Grande. San Brito and Bachili were larger villages, where Tolokai, Oven, and LA 265 were smaller residential clusters. We intentionally selected bones that represented different individuals for this study to ensure that we did not collect redundant data. So here's the sample here. The majority of these samples dated pre-AD 900, with nearly half likely dating pre-AD 700. For features or components that lacked radiocarbon or archaeomagnetic data, we analyzed the ceramics of those features to estimate the occupation date. That was Dean Wilson, who did all the analysis for us. The study sample did not include any turkeys that dated earlier than AD 500, as none were available from the repositories we searched for this study. Most of the remains were recovered from the upper fill and floor fill of residential pit houses, but few remains were recovered from extramural pits and a storage structure. The maize plant, having originated in a tropical climate, uses C4 carbon fixation instead of C3 carbon fixation, which results in a greater proportion of the heavier carbon-13 isotopic form relative to the lighter carbon-12 form, and therefore an enriched isotopic signature. Enriched C13 in ancient bone collagen is interpreted as a signal for prehistoric maize consumption. Other indigenous plants with enriched C13 levels include amaranth, agave, and yucca, all of which were domesticated or heavily used by humans. Therefore, we can assume turkeys with high C4 signatures were consistently consuming plants that were domesticated by humans, including maize, amaranth, agave, and yucca, indicating that turkeys were domesticated and kept by early Pueblo groups. The higher C4 signatures are likely driven by maize, given the importance of maize in prehistoric farming communities in the early Pueblo Southwest. But the increased C4 signatures at a minimum indicates a diet of primarily domesticated plants. Generally, the expected collagen isotopic signatures for C3 and C4 plants are based on the average values of negative 26.5 per mil and negative 12.5 per mil. In the Southwest, these estimates are used to broadly classify ancient humans and turkeys as C3, C4, or mixed feeders. In order to estimate the actual proportion of maize C4 in ancient turkey diet, we took into account the known variation in C13 and nitrogen-15 isotope concentrations in plants and their fractionation to bone collagen to calculate a probability distribution for the proportion of maize C4 and C3 in the diet using a Bayesian mixing model. Based on a pollen analysis of turkey coprolites at the turkey pen site, we postulated a diet consisting broadly of two components, maize amaranth being one, and the other being C3 grasses, nuts, and seeds. Then we calculated means and standard deviations of the stable isotope concentrations for these components based on published concentrations of archaeological and recent flora. The collagen isotope signatures from the sample of 19 turkey remains from the 5 early Pueblo habitation locales are presented in this table, but on the next slide is a visual representation. This graph shows the results of the stable isotope analysis on the 19 samples. You can see all of them are plot near the expected domesticated diet for pure maize or pure C3. And there's only one that appears to be mixed. The range from negative 14.2 per mil to negative 7 with a median of negative 8.3 represents a fairly strong signal for C4 or domesticated plants. As C3 plants, they generally range from negative 29 to negative 21. So we're well outside of that range. This slide presents the posterior probability distributions for the diet proportions made up of C3 and C4 components using the sample of the 19 turkeys analyzed. The model suggests a very high proportion of maize and or amaranth in the diet and a relatively low proportion of C3 plants in the diet. Turkeys from all sites, with one exception, spanning the 6th to the 11th centuries in our sample exhibited a diet rich in C4 plants, which is consistent with the maize-reliant diet and domestication. So this slide presents a scatter plot of carbon and nitrogen isotopic values with distributions of isotope concentrations for the 2 diet components. The sample of turkeys from Basket Maker 3 and Pueblo 1 context from this study is represented by circles, and you'll see them all mostly on the right side of this graph. And it is closely clustered with a sample from the Pueblo 2 and Pueblo 3 contexts in the middle San Juan region from McCaffrey and others, and that's represented in these triangles. So you can see there's not much of a difference between the way that these are plotting between Basket Maker 3 all the way to Pueblo 3. The values are very similar. A sample of modern wild turkeys, which is represented by the plus signs, are differentiated from the ancient domestic turkeys by their carbon-13 and nitrogen-15 values, which are reflective of the C3 plants native to the Southwest rather than maize and amaranth. So this graph basically indicates that although we know later P2 and P3 turkey were eating copious amounts of corn or amaranth or other seed-poor plants, turkey, even dating back to, again, Bascom Acre 3, were consuming a similar level of domesticated plants in the diet. The only pattern of deposition we noted in the entire study was in the Rio Grande at site LA-265, which is again along the Santa Fe River near where it dumps into the Rio Grande. We found a turkey buried in a formal pit, which consumed a much higher proportion of C4 plants, where there was another sample that was discarded in the upper fill of a feature, and which is circled in red at the bottom here, which consumed closer to a mixed C3 or more of a C3 diet than the individual that was buried. So based on the results of stable isotopic analysis of the sample of 19 bones from 5 early Pueblo habitation sites in the northern Southwest, we can conclude that turkeys were domesticated in these areas likely prior to Bascom Acre 3 or the early developmental period, so pre-AD 500 or 600. The data lend additional support to the idea that turkey domestication in the northern Southwest did not begin during the Bascom Acre 3 period, as some have suspected, and likely occurred during the preceding Bascom Acre 2 or Archaic periods. We have presented evidence that turkeys were feeding primarily on C4 plants, which most likely includes maize, prior to the intensification and exploitation of large numbers of turkeys by early Pueblo groups in later periods, such as P2, P3. This study demonstrated that turkeys found within Pueblo residential communities in northwest New Mexico and southwest Colorado were consuming a similar proportion of C4 plants for at least several hundred years prior. The study also demonstrated that a Bayesian mixing model can be useful for inferring the composition of ancient turkey diet and the diets of other domesticated or semi-domesticated animals. The model is not intended as a complete reconstruction of the turkey diet. Rather, it is intended to provide a probability distribution for the proportion of maize, C4 or C3 plants in the diet, given the data and the assumptions of the model. We identified a difference in C4 consumption and deposition practices between two turkeys in the northern Rio Grande. And this pattern is interesting, that the turkey with a higher C4 diet, again, was formerly buried, and the one with a primarily C3 diet was discarded into the depression of an abandoned pit house. The same pattern was not observed in our San Juan Basin sample, where we did find turkey in formal burials and discarded into upper pit house fill. But the sample size is very, very small and may not actually represent patterns in the archaeological record, something to certainly look into in the future. Because our current study supports the notion that turkeys in P2, P3 were consuming a very similar proportion of C4 plants to turkeys several hundred years earlier during the Bascom Acre 3 and P1 period, we do recommend that future studies should examine the diet of even earlier turkeys, again, Bascom Acre 2 or Archaic, if you can find them, to explore when and where turkey domestication occurred in the Southwest. So I'd like to thank the Paleoest Foundation for providing funding for this study. And I'd also like to thank the Navajo Nation Heritage and Historic Preservation Department, Pueblo Cochiti, Bureau of Reclamation, NMAC, and OAS for their assistance with this study. So we're going to get started with our second round of presentations here. The next presentation will be by Jacob Seedig with his presentation, A Prehistoriography of the Ancient Members.
Okay, just getting all set up here. We should be good. So thanks for having me. It's exciting to present at this virtual conference. I've been looking forward to it. So 2020, as we all know, has been an unconventional year. So I thought it would be fun to do what for me is a bit of an unconventional presentation. Anyone that's heard my talks before knows that I typically have an extensive presentation prepared that I speak extemporaneously on top of. My presentations also tend to be pretty narrowly focused, either on the Woodrow site, the members transitional phase, Pithouse to Pueblo transition, ritual religious transformations in the members region. But for this presentation, I decided to take a page out of one of my former advisors, Steve Lexon's books, and do something bigger picture. So please bear with me while I read most of the paper, or at least attempt to do that, which is not something I typically do, and do something that's less concrete and more theoretical. I hope you find it interesting and entertaining. So the basis of this work comes from Dr. Lexon's last book and his work overall. But in this last book, A Study of Southwestern Archaeology, Steve says that archaeology is history, and archaeologists must write history or do prehistoriography. So this presentation is my attempt to do so for the Mimbres region. I'll touch on many of the Mimbres ideas that Dr. Lexon presents in his book trilogy, while providing my own take. So Steve has referred to the Mimbres as a weather vane, pointing to at the Hohokam when they were flourishing, and then Chaco as it boomed. But the people of the Mimbres were more than just faceless reactionaries. They had their own unique histories and reasons for being tied more closely to Hohokam or Chaco and ancestral Puebloans at different points in time. So I'm going to present a history of the broader Southwest from this Mimbres prehistory. From this Mimbres periphery. You know, what did the Mimbres people actually experience and go through? Since the focus of this conference is on the Pithouse to Pueblo transition, which is the time period I work in the Mimbres, I'm going to overlook broad swaths of important history and focus on the late Pithouse to classic periods. Late Pithouse begins around 550 CE in the Mimbres region, and by that time, the people there were producing a material culture which archaeologists have broadly defined as Mugion, so pit houses with brown paste ceramics, which by 700 CE were covered with lustrous red slips. Maize had become an integral part of the Mimbres diet, and by the three-circle phase of the late Pithouse period, Mimbres Mugion had become its own defined archaeological culture. Simultaneously, about 300 kilometers south and west, the Hohokam were in the midst of a cultural fluorescence in the colonial period. The Mimbres weather vane had pointed towards the Hohokam. As Steve and many other Mimbres scholars have pointed out, there's much cultural material evidence that suggests Mimbres and Hohokam were closely connected, including red on buff ceramics, cremations, shell artifacts, canal irrigation, and some of the images I have featured here. Though these connections seem strongest during the late Pithouse period, I should note that they do persist into the classic. You know, for me, sort of anecdotally, one of the first things that I experienced as sort of seeing this connection between Mimbres and Hohokam was while I was thumbing through Howry's excavations of Snaketown for a grad class, and I came across an image of, and the images in the book are black and white, and I saw a picture of a bull. It was a Santa Cruz Red on Buff bull. I think it may be one of them that I have pictured here that looked, you know, if you're going quick and not paying much attention, it looked like Mimbres style one. And in fact, Hegman and Nelson in 2007 conducted a study to quantify the apparent similarities between Mimbres and Hohokam ceramics, and they found that Hohokam elements were much more common on earlier Mimbres ceramics style 1 and 2, and then waned during Mimbres style 3 in the classic period. Again, there's other cultural material artifacts that have connections between Mimbres and Hohokam that I've got pictured here, but these are pretty well known, and I'm going to skip past them for now. I am going to mention more about features, specifically these courtyard groups. This too has been noted by many archaeologists, but interestingly, during the colonial period in the Hohokam and then the late Pithouse period in the Mimbres, there does seem to be some evidence of pit houses being arranged in these courtyard groups. So anywhere from 2 to 4 pit houses clustered together, maybe an open central space. Which again, to me, these lines of evidence suggest that the Hohokam or Hohokam material culture was readily adopted into Mimbres society during the late Pithouse period. Yet by the end of the late Pithouse period and the beginning of the Classic period, this relationship seems to have waned. For Steve, it's not a coincidence that this period of time, approximately 950 to 1000 CE or so, coincides with the rapid expansion of Chaco. I'm going to return to this interplay, or lack thereof, between Mimbres and Chaco in a bit. So outside of the Hohokam leitmotif, Mimbres archaeologists have long been aware of some of these differences between the late Pithouse and Classic periods. During the late Pithouse period, Mimbres society had large subterranean communal structures or great kivas. Ceramics were more geometric. And there's a variety of other things that I've spoken about as recently as 2 weeks ago at the 2020 Mogollon Round Robin Conference, and I'm not going to get too in depth to in here. But suffice to say, there's a lot of transformations that occurred between the late Pithouse and Classic periods. And I think that these are tied to transformations in religion. And as will become clear, some of those religious transformations, I think, are actually sort of pushback against what was happening at Chaco during this time. So yeah, it's clear that there were transformations. And as I mentioned, one of the ways that Dr. Lexon has explained these transformations is that the Mimbres windsock or Mimbres weather vane started pointing north to Chaco at this period in time. Now, it's not a secret that the Mimbres Classic period coincides almost exactly with the sort of the real boom of Chaco. So I pulled a few images here, and you can see, some of the earliest big great houses in Chaco Canyon proper, Una Vida, Peñasco Blanco, and Pueblo Bonito are really starting to take off from the early 900s. That's this key transitional period in the Mimbres region. And then by the early 1000s, we start to see the growth and expansion of the sort of the Bonito phase in Chaco. Citing Howry and other earlier scholars, Steve thinks, or has written that Anasazi swamping may have occurred in the Mimbres during this time, and it was perhaps a result of people fleeing the Chaco system. In various places in his book trilogy, Dr. Lexon describes numerous developments during the Mimbres Classic period that are Anasazi inspired, if not directly made by ancestral Puebloan immigrants to the Mimbres region. These include slip-slop black and white ceramics, Pruden units, above-ground stone architecture, indented corrugated ceramics, images of ritual paraphernalia on Mimbres ceramics, roads, and even potential great house emulations in the Mimbres at Woodrow, potentially where I worked. These pieces of evidence do point to broader connections to the northern Southwest, but I don't see these transformations as Mimbres embracing Chaco. Instead, I think that the transformations that we see between the late Pithouse and Classic period were actually a Mimbres refutation of Chaco. In other words, the Mimbres region was a place where people could come from the north, people that weren't Chaco, people that wanted to escape this really strong Chacoan ideology, but at the same time practice a lifestyle that was more Puebloan and eventually would come back around and lead to this Pueblo lifestyle that we see in the 13th and 14th centuries. First, though, I think it's important to contextualize what was happening in the Mimbres region during the Classic period. And one of the things that I want to point out, because we're talking about the Mimbres, is the ceramics. So this map that I have on the right doesn't have anything to do with ceramics. It's a well-known map. I'm sure most people have seen it. And it shows the distribution of Chaco and great houses. And I just wanted sort of people to pay attention to the southern extent of where we see Chaco and great houses. This next image is a distribution of sites where style 3 or Classic period Mimbres ceramics have been recovered. And this is to the best of my knowledge. I'm sure I'm lacking some sites here. But even though these maps aren't to scale, you can see there's a pretty clear boundary between where we see the extent of Chaco and great houses and the extent of Classic period Mimbres pottery. And again, this isn't a surprise to Dr. Lexon. This isn't new. This isn't a novel finding. According to Dr. Lexon, Chaco could have anything it wanted, and it didn't want Mimbres pottery. He provides a possible explanation for why Mimbres bowls are absent in Chaco. Quote, perhaps the vivid Mimbres cosmology expressed in those beautiful, terrible bowls was a reaction to Chaco, a reinvention of Mimbres to avoid whatever cosmologies Chaco was willing to sell, unquote. I think Dr. Alexin was right in this assessment. And again, it's sort of borne out in the distribution of Mimbres pottery. It's not only found in the Mimbres River Valley, there's a pretty wide distribution of it, west, south, and east, but there seems to be a hard boundary to the north. I think this is because Mimbres had developed its own unique ritual religious system that was partly reflected in the bowls. And that system, again, was pushed back to Chaco. It was Mimbres saying, this is not us, we're doing something different. Another key piece of evidence for this, I think, is in great kivas or subterranean communal structures. Now, as we just heard in Carrie and Shauna's presentation, great kivas are pretty ubiquitous across the Southwest prior to Chaco. We have them in the Mimbres region during the late Pithouse period, but it's really there's a real expansion of great kivas during the Classic period. And I wanted to pull some quotes from a few different works here. One by Ruth Van Dyke, who conducted a study of Chaco great kivas. So this is from her 2007 piece. And she found that 21 great kivas were built in Chaco Canyon between 900 and 1120 CE. This was a period of rapid and extensive construction in Chaco when it was reaching its apogee. So it shouldn't be surprising that multiple great kivas were built during this time. And to quote Ruth, Chaco and great kivas embody symbolic meaning specific to the canyon, to canyon society in the 11th century. The structures are part of the architectural representation of ideas that help legitimate Chacoan social and political authority. However, if we look at the Mimbres region and a really quintessential work, by Daryl Creel and Roger Anion, it becomes clear that in the Mimbres region, great kivas were being burned at the same time. They were really falling out of fashion. Although some great kiva use does seem to continue into the Classic, there was a major shift between the late Pithouse and Classic periods. And again, in my mind, this sort of is a refutation of this sort of great kiva ideology that as it's expanding in Chaco, we see a real pullback in the Mimbres. And what we see also in the Mimbres is the expansion of plazas, more open community structures. So what we have on the left here are some well-known Classic period Mimbres sites that I've just sort of quickly sketched. We see many room blocks clustered together with open plaza space. And again, these may be sort of the precedents of later big pueblos that we see to the east and to the north of Mimbres in the Rio Grande and the Cibola regions. But this isn't the only, so we're moving into post-Classic Mimbres now. So again, Chaco ends and Mimbres ends at the same time. And Mimbres people start moving. We know they move to the east. There's been some work by Peggy Nelson and Michelle Hegman in Eastern Mimbres, and we know there's evidence of them moving south into Casas Grandes, which kind of seems counterintuitive. If Mimbres really was eschewing Chaco and Chaco had little or no interest in Mimbres, why would both end simultaneously? It would seem that freed from the yoke of Chaco, Mimbres might instead be expected to flourish. This may have been the case if Chaco and Mimbres were locked in violent confrontations or had an extremely antagonistic relationship. There's no evidence of this, and I might point people to Katie Bostian's doctoral dissertation, who she examined evidence for violence in the Mimbres, and there's a Kiva article associated with this. But when Chaco deflated, the air was sucked out of the room. If anti-Chaco sentiment helped unite Mimbres society and ritual, Chaco's decline may have caused the social cohesion to fray. This is not to say that the decreasing influence of Chaco directly led to the end of the Mimbres Classic. Decades of Mimbres research has identified a number of potential factors, including drought. Certainly, these were all interwoven and contributed to the end of the Classic Mimbres period. However, considering Mimbres in the broader history of the American Southwest and Mexican Northwest provides a new lens for considering the end of the Classic period. So I'm running out of time, and I just want to sum up. What I'm trying to do in this talk is to bring together these different threads of research that have been evident to Mimbres archaeologists and that Dr. Lexon has spoken to before, to really try to write a prehistoriography of the Mimbres. Tell the history of the Mimbres from the Mimbres perspective. There's clearly interesting things going on with the Hohokam in the late Pithouse period, and then in the Mimbres in the Classic period. And in order to truly understand these, we have to use a Mimbres perspective and think about how Mimbres people may have been experiencing and reacting to these things. So thanks for the time. Again, this is sort of a fun activity for me. I don't typically give papers like this. I hope everyone continues to stay safe and healthy. And just as the conference was starting, I think everyone's probably aware now that there's been a call in the presidential election. So there's lots of exciting things happening. And yes, thank you for your time.
Well, thank you very much, Jacob. Next, we have Mr. Thatcher Rogers, and the title of his presentation is The Mimbres Horizon, Northern Viejo, or Something in Between, the Pithouse to Pueblo Transition in Far Southwestern New Mexico. Thatcher.
Thank you. So I'm going to start off by saying that this is my talk. This is going to build a little bit on what Jacob's talking on, and a lot of work done by Pat Gilman and others. The contemporary international United States-Mexico border is one of the most substantial impediments to connecting the archaeological record of the American Southwest to that located just south of it in northwest Mexico. Beyond simply a physical barrier that at times obstructs, destroys, and restricts access to archaeological sites and materials along its length, the border impacts the literature Southwestern archaeologists read, written in English, who they speak to, mostly other American Southwest archaeologists, and what collections and sites are investigated or included in analyses. As a result, archaeological sites located both along the border and those directly south of it are often framed using a quasi-nearest neighbor approach, or categorized by what has been called frontier logic in other places, such as southwestern Arizona. On formative period sites, this would be the whichever decorated ceramic type is most represented is the assumed archaeological cultural affiliation approach. While this has many obvious flaws, this process is relatively valid given the limited archaeological research in the area, particularly in terms of excavation, and the poor historical development of culture history, and notably the International Four Corners, where I've circled there. The International Four Corners, or where the states of Arizona, New Mexico, Chihuahua, and Sonora meet, is characterized like most of southeastern Arizona, northeastern Sonora, and the Boot Heel by Sky Island topography, with sets of predominantly north-south running mountain chains interspaced by wide, low basin valleys with the occasional perennial water source like the San Pedro River, or seasonal playas like Wilcox Playa present. While these areas result in obstacles to the movement of people and are seasonally harsher than adjacent areas, they also provide variable resources and ecological niches upon an elevational gradient. The majority of previous archaeological research in this part of the International Four Corners, located in far southeastern Arizona and southwestern New Mexico, is focused on a single research question. How did late pre-Hispanic sites, Animas phase, relate to the emergent regional polity in northwestern Chihuahua, Casas Grandes? Consequently, past investigators have treated the area as uninhabited or of minimal interest during the pre-1200s, or as obviously included within the Mimbres or within the Viejo period Casas Grandes culture areas. Yet, unfortunately, few discussions for the pre-1200 archaeological record exist. This paper puts forth a very general description of and assessment for these data and compares these data to the better understood areas of the Mimbres and Casas Grandes. As you can see by the radiocarbon distribution plot for specimens from projects in southern Hidalgo County, many of these dates have large error ranges with few specimens present and a wide distribution between the end of the late Archaic and through historic Apache use of the landscape. As mentioned, the culture history for this area is typically either lumped together with the Mimbres or the Casas Grandes, although there does exist a relatively unknown local sequence, and that is the post-Archaic to 801150 time period is simply known as the San Luis phase. Yes, nearly 1,000-year sequence in a single phase with no true definition, no detailed description, and no early late subdivision. The San Luis phase was simply just stated by Frank Finlow in the limited summary of his systematic survey of the area, which remains the sole systematic survey to date in this area. Finlow found several dozen sites that dated to this time period based on surface ceramics, which I'll discuss below, but he never really published the raw data nor described any specifics about individual sites. The San Luis phase, though, is mentioned as a localized variation of the trends found in the Mimbres region. And later archaeologists note the lack of kiva structures, the lack of construction of masonry room block compounds for the most part, and lack of Mimbres pottery production locally, although they were clearly imported into the area. Given the absence of a robust description and the limited use of culture history-based archaeology, many recent archaeologists eschew the San Luis phase and instead emphasize the Mimbres-ness of the area. So this is the first option in a lot of ways. The first cultural temporal association is the late Pithouse, the classic period, classic Mimbres periods. Although importing the trends found in the Mimbres region, archaeologists argue the boot heel represents a part of the greater Mimbres region that Jacob was just talking about during this time, at least. To their credit, the occurrence of both procurement and sizable habitation sites in the Deming Plain, the San Simon, and further along near Columbus and along the Cedar Mountains provide supporting lines of evidence for this argument. These areas include sites with estimated room counts of 50 to 100 rooms in some locations, while sites in the San Simon showcase a slightly different trend that I discuss later. The recently termed transitional phase, see the excellent work by Jacob Sedig, Barbara Oath, and Steve Lexon on transition from Pithouse communities to construction of early adobe, presence of figurative designs on pottery, many designs of which have been advocated by Mark Thompson and Pat Gilman to signify the arrival and adoption of Mesoamerican aspects, religious aspects of the Mesoamerican hero twins mythos during the classic period. This transition represents a bridge between Pithouse household clusters and the construction of masonry room block compounds with plaza spaces and smaller kivas and ceremonial rooms. The second option considered is the Viejo period of northwestern Chihuahua. This time period is relatively poorly known, although recent investigations by Jane Kelly, Joe Stewart, and Mike Searcy have and will continue to provide insight beyond relying on Charles de Peso's data. However, given many clear divergences between the records found by de Peso in the central Casas Grandes region and Kelly and Stewart's in the southern Casas Grandes area, I restrict this discussion to those done by de Peso. The Viejo period is more or less now generally subdivided into two time periods, 600 to 900, or maybe 1,000, and 1,000 to 1150, based on the presence of Mimbres black on white and some internal changes that you can see here. This option is advocated by those who upstream late pre-Hispanic interpretations. By that I mean because the international four corners became more integrated with material and social exchange patterns with the Casas Grandes culture centered at Paquimé in the 13th century, and infers that this represents a longer-term trend as proposed. So the transition between pit houses to Pueblos occurs during the Viejo period at approximately the same time as that in the Mimbres area, and in general the chronologies sort of do match up pretty well. While archaeologists have mostly scrapped the Convento, Pilon, and Perros Bravos designations of de Peso, they clearly reflect the spectrum across the pit house to Pueblo transition in Chihuahua, with Convento and Pilon representing pit houses and Perros Bravos, or the late Viejo period, with above ground attached or single adobe structures. This sequence is identifiable also within individual sites such as Convento. Unlike the Mimbres area, there are no great kivas during this time period, but there are centrally located and then appended larger structures that likely acted in a similar communal manner. But given these two models, what data currently exist from the pre-Animas phase boot heel that support occupation in the area during the Pithouse to Pueblo transition? Early surveys by the Cosgroves and others didn't really identify any of these villages, nor did they note many Mimbres contemporary sites, although they certainly found sites with Mimbres pottery, mostly Mimbres corrugated. Zooming in on the radiocarbon distribution plot I showed earlier, we note that several sites clearly have use during this time period, with several dates dating to the 9th, 10th, and mostly 9th, 10th, and mostly 12th centuries, and with distributions overlapping. This list is based on the emphasis on cave sites and sizable habitation villages, which date predominantly post 1200 in the region, although some, such as Maddox Ruin, Gray Ranch Ruin, clearly have Mimbres components underlying or adjacent to Animas phase room blocks. This association between Animas phase compounds and underlying or adjacent earlier components dating to the Pithouse to Pueblo transition is supported by my discovery of a bag of mostly Mimbres style 2 and 3 and associated types during my analysis of the Joyceville ceramic assemblage, a sizable Animas phase village with a ball court. A sketch map found in the bag shows that these sherds came from a small pit house site located across the historic irrigation channel from the main later room blocks, and this site was never recorded. Additional member sherds have also been found atop other animist phase villages during short revisits in the late 1980s and mid 2000s, and these escaped earlier recognition. Given these data, primarily ceramic surface assemblages lacking clear members masonry or Viejo adobe architecture, what kinds of sites and functions are identifiable in the boot heel during the 9th through 12th centuries, so across this transition? More recent survey by Chris Turnbow and colleagues, C. Kristen Graham and others, have identified really the entire sequence of Mimbres pottery and small sherd scatters with slight superficial depressions at some of those. These are argued to represent mostly seasonal occupation or procurement sites, as are those cave sites reported by Lambert and Ambler and McClooney from the School for American Research's Hidalgo 1 and 2 projects. There are also some potential small hamlets based on those depressions and distributions of ceramic artifacts at sites, although many areas have been heavily impacted by mechanical activities and natural erosion. The best known of these would be LA 54052, the Dog Springs site, which is located actually just along the border almost, which has adobe remnants and early Mimbres types. There are some Mimbres communities, classic communities in this area, although these again are mostly located in northern Hidalgo County, the main exception being Cabin Wells, LA 89227, and this is located just east of the Hatchet Mountains and maybe one of the furthest south Mimbres room blocks. This relatively sizable site likely represents the largest community in southern Hidalgo at its time, although a potential contender that remains unrecorded is the Maddox Ruin site in Playas Valley that also has an animist phase component on top of it. The counts of potential Pithouse and Mimbres contemporary ceramic types are displayed here in yellow with the number of sites represented in green. The total number of recorded sites, and this is from Finlow's data, by the Finlow survey was 56. So the overwhelming majority of Pithouse or Mimbres dating sites contain plainware, which is the #1 reported ceramic, followed by what is likely reserve corrugated or less likely convento or casas grandes corrugated. The number of sites with reserve corrugated is relatively close to those with Mimbres sherds, suggesting slightly under half of all sites date to this 900 to 1130 time slice, given Finlow did denote the difference between boldface and classic, but he didn't between transitional and classic, so styles 2 and 3. Based on these data, we clearly have low-level use of the landscape during this transitional period. However, the limited metadata from this project this time preclude further consideration. We also lack any real sourcing for the Mimbres pottery that we've seen here, or the Casas Grandes pottery. Perhaps this will change in the next year. Stay tuned. And then these data are from HS1, a mostly San Luis phase hamlet with 2 radiocarbon dates suggesting a 9th through 10th century occupation, followed by a later and smaller animist phase habitation on top of it. Again, this supports the other data that suggests San Luis phase sites dating to the Pithouse to Pueblo transition are likely to be encountered underneath or near animist phase communities, a similar phenomenon which is identifiable along the San Pedro in southeastern Arizona and suggested in notes and site files from the Amarant Arizona State Museum for northwestern Chihuahua. We find these similar trends also in the work by Ted Sales and much more commonly in the excellent work by Pat Gilman and colleagues in the San Simon Valley, which is located just west of Hidalgo and shares a relatively similar topography. Their investigations identified a trend of increasing painted ceramics, both local and non-local Hohokam and Mimbres types during the late pit structure period, so 900 to 1050, so that transitional really phase. Following this, the presence of early single surface rooms with cimiento and jacal architecture and Mimbres painted and corrugated pottery are identifiable during what's termed the surface structure period, which terminates around 1150, so really the latter portion of the Mimbres classic. Most sites are relatively small with few sites overall, as it appears the area was predominantly depopulated after that. And Gilman interprets these sites as used mostly for seasonal tasks such as seasonal agricultural field houses and hunting and associated with larger communities that are really being aggregating during this time period in the Safford Basin. So to bring this all together, in conclusion, while the data from the International Four Corners are scarce, unequally distributed, and often incongruent, they showcase an occupation on a valley-to-valley scale between 800 to 1130, with earlier components very probable. Given the absence of excavation, we are currently unable to determine specifically when the transition occurred. That is, if it happened closer to 900, 1000, or 1100. So are we looking more at a chronology that's closer to Mimbres or Viejo in the Casas Grandes? Or even if there were contemporaneous use of above ground structures and Pithouse in the area. I tend to think that interpretation is possible, but most likely we're seeing something different given what we have for data. This bipartite settlement patterning is probably the result of time and is found in the San Simon Valley. So slightly earlier, pre-1050, use of the area was expanded by mostly seasonally mobile groups at a few Pithouse hamlets, and then mostly post-1050 sites are associated with expanding outward populations of groups from the Mimbres Valley who live in above ground adobe room block compounds, such as at Cabin Wells, and that kind of fits in with the trends that Jacob was just talking about. While we've yet to identify any of those single structures as found in the San Simon, in southern Hidalgo County, in another in northern Chihuahua, it's probable that such structures exist, or perhaps even use of pithouse-like field houses continued through the 11th century, followed by intermittent use of the area between 1050 to 1200 or 1225. So to circle back to the main question of whether this area best fits Mimbres or Casas Grandes archaeological record, the answer is not so clear-cut. While many attributes are closely attuned to Mimbres, such as the ceramic assemblages and temporal occupations, the specific locations of sites and their few definitive architectural elements suggest this area represents a boundary zone, or perhaps in more common parlance, an edge region that maintains a distinctive flavor outside of Mimbres, and in many ways, like the San Simon, Sulphur Springs, San Bernardino valleys that you see there, at least until the post-classic. That's another talk. For that reason, the transitional phase as found in the Mimbres is unlikely to be as cleanly identifiable in this area, also the low populations. But excavations may hopefully prove this wrong. Until then, I really recommend we retain the San Luis phase, subdividing into early and late, or employ really the late Pithouse period as a designation, while also carefully assessing the potential for short-term use by local groups all the way through the Mimbres Classic, and slightly larger, potentially inward-moving Mimbres groups at sites like we saw at Columbus Pueblo, Maddox Ruin, and then the Cabin Wells site. And I want to thank these individuals for their support and contributions. Thank you.
Thank you, Thatcher. I did notice we did have someone raise their hand during that presentation, and we're going to wait until after Mr. Larson completes his presentation to address it. But if you'd like, you can go ahead and submit your question to the Q&A function of the webinar here, so we can all see it. So next up, we have Mr. Andy Larson with the title of his presentation is Ethnogenesis in the Verde Valley, Arizona.
Hello, let me share my screen here. All right, yeah, thank you for the presentations that came before. I think all these themes of identity and regional systems will kind of dovetail pretty nicely into my presentation, which, as Kai said, is called Ethnogenesis in the Verde Valley, Arizona. Share that, okay. So archaeology at its core is a scientific interpretive process that seeks to bring meaning to the material remains of past peoples. This process uses taxonomic classifications to distill our interpretations of material remains into culture groups. In the northern Southwest, the Pecos classification has laid the framework for archaeological inquiry for more than 100 years, and for good reason. It's a useful tool that categorizes past people based on major technological developments and subsistence practices. This classification system generally works well within the northern Southwest as gradual shifts in ceramic traditions are coupled with gradual architectural evolution from houses to pueblos. While archaeologists certainly understand this shift as a complex process, we continue to rely on the taxonomic systems that frame the development or evolution of people within a trajectory where one group of people develops a technology or a style that begets another, and so on through a long period of time. As we continue to examine the ancient Southwest, the material record and traditional histories of descendant communities consistently show that the lives of past people in the region did not always fit neatly into taxonomic classification systems. People traveled, traded, moved, and simply interacted over immense geographic areas with extremely complex social dynamics. In order to account for this complexity, many phases and subcategories have been defined to distinguish local manifestations within a period or culture group. But these only begin to address questions of complex dynamics of ancient peoples. Through this presentation, I'd like to pose the question, how do we better examine and interpret the complex social processes in the Southwest? And how do we shift away from narratives that emphasize unilinear histories and embrace the messiness of human pasts? To do this, I'd like to look at the southern Sonawa of the Verde Valley in central Arizona, on the periphery of the Colorado Plateau, northern Southwest, to examine the prevailing narrative of ancestral Pueblo and evolution and demonstrate how periphery areas can help archaeologists develop a more complex understanding of ancient dynamics. So here we again have the map of the Southwest with the different culture groups. The southern Sonawa are down in the Verde Valley here, and the northern up near Flagstaff and the surrounding cultures. So again, the Verde Valley here it's in north central Arizona. It's one of the wettest regions in the Southwest with lots of perennial waterways, the Verde River being the primary one, but also Oak Creek coming down through Sedona, and Sycamore Creek, Beaver Creek. It's a very wet place, and so you would expect it, to be heavily populated. These are a couple of pictures of a couple of the national monuments here. We have Tuzi Gut and Montezuma's Castle. So here's the Verde Valley sequence. It was developed by Bredernitz in 1960, kind of based on some of the earlier stuff from Kaywood and Spicer back in the 30s when they were doing some of the initial work. But you can see the Verde sequence compared to the Puebloan sequence and various Hohokam sequences as well. And these taxonomic sequences kind of categorize these peoples. They break technological, boundaries and display different kinds of shifts in the technologies and lifeways, right? But by differentiating it so strictly and in the way that these chronologies typically have been shaped, does that shape theoretical approaches or research designs? So with that being said, I'm going to just highlight some of the different things in the southern Sonawa region and how the Hohokam and Pueblo influences kind of ebb and flow down there. So in 81 to 800, there's very little work's been done in mostly amateur collections. And in addition to the local brown wares, the trade wares are pretty much mostly all Hohokam, early Hohokam, Snaketown, and stuff like that. And then moving into the 800 to 1000 range, you still have the Hohokam influence predominating. You have Hohokam type pit houses mostly, but some of the smaller, more northern, southwestern, ancestral Puebloan types are becoming prevalent. The public architecture is still very much Hohokam at this point: mounds, canals, ball courts, and towards the end of this is when we start to see this shift starting to occur with above ground masonry architecture. So yeah, moving on from 1000 to 1125, give or take, you see the lessening of the Hohokam influence in the Upper Verde. Ceramic types are now being kind of trade wares coming in from the Kayenta and Winslow regions, like your Tucson and Little Colorado white wares and things like that. In the Middle Verde, you still do have a whole suite of Hohokam type things. ceramic styles, house styles, cremations, ball courts, platform mounds. And also it's beginning to be a shift from your canal irrigated fields to more Puebloan type dryland farming techniques with check dams and terraces and grids and things like that. So here's just a kind of a graphic representation of that kind of time period. We have your red on buffs going to the black on whites here. Pit houses are starting to be replaced by these above ground pueblos of small and big. Some of the bigger sites are starting to form, to emerge at that point too, and then canals kind of going towards more of these dry land check dam style architectural techniques. So the later phases here, now we're getting into just pretty much entirely Puebloan influence. So that transition from Pit House to Pueblo also kind of marks a shift from regional influence in this southern Sonawa edge transition kind of periphery zone. So we're starting to see the Tuzi Gute Pueblo and Montezuma's Castle, both are big multi-story pueblos, and those are kind of starting to take hold there. The Hohokam traits are mostly absent and have been replaced by Puebloan and Northern Sonawa ceramics and architectural styles. Large pueblos instead of pit house villages, cave baits, cliff dwellings are now what's going on. The use of irrigation canals continues in some capacity, but mostly it's widespread dryland farming to increase the arable land in the area. Because once you get away from any of the water sources, it is just, you know, pretty scrubby desert. And then moving on to 1300 to 1425, the increased consolidation of pueblos is continued, and those, you know, smaller areas are either left, people have moved on, or they've moved to the big pueblos. So population consolidation, like you see in much of the Southwest at this time period. So talking about political and economic systems, like I said before, around the early 11th century, the Verde Valley as a Hohokam hinterland kind of begins to fade, and it begins to be heavily influenced by Puebloan ideas. This is visible through ceramics that were traced to Chavez Pass and Humalabi and other areas in the nearby Colorado Plateau. Wilcox has put forth one idea of the complexities surrounding the Verde Valley here, which he called the Verde Confederacy, which is like a cooperation between some of these big pueblos and the surrounding smaller pueblos and villages, which he thinks were these big pueblos forming an alliance to reject Hohokam influence in order to preserve their relationships with ancestral Puebloan trade partners. And also, even within the Verde Valley, you see even more complexities with the Salado polychromes being present in the south and not the north, and so there's even more dynamic things happening there, aside from what's, you know, going on, you know, outside of the Verde Valley. But I mean, these periphery zones, they're more complex than areas in the core, if you want to call it that or whatever. As you would expect, they're more complex. They have a lot more, you know, interaction going on between the groups and different distinctive culture groups, or however you want to call that. But my point is here that because it's more visible in these periphery zones, doesn't mean it wasn't as complex or also very complex otherwise, as we saw in some of the previous presentations, which did a really good job displaying that. Yeah, so are we to believe that such complexities are limited to these areas, or are they just more visible in these areas? Well, they're obviously more visible, but I mean, they're also obviously not limited to that, again, as we've seen. The archaeological evidence from the Verde Valley just shows these better as it does in other areas like we were seeing from other parts. So the lack of material variation doesn't necessarily equal lack of social, economic, political variation. And these homogeneous material cultures that we see in other parts of the Southwest are just more homogeneous, and the material remains. Distinguishing the socioeconomic complexities is more difficult in areas with more homogeneous remains, right? Thinking or knowing that things are more complex but lacking the hard data to prove it is, it's kind of one of the classic predicaments of archaeology. It's hard because we have to go off of what we can see, even though we might know that there's a lot more stuff going on. So here's a quote from Fowler and Cordell. The Pecos classification defining 7 sequential periods, basket banker through Pueblo, is still used by Southwestern archaeologists working with ancestral Pueblo remains. However, while it is a useful and convenient device to organize archaeological data, it references architecture and pottery, not ancient tribes or other social units. Archaeologists and Pueblo Indians recognize today that Pueblo Indians represent combinations of more than one archaeological tradition. So, it's a thing that we all kind of understand and know, but how do we get past that is the question. So coming to my conclusion here, the Pithouse to Pueblo transition was a complex social process that varied significantly through time and space. The abundant and varied archaeological record in the Verde Valley enunciates the transition's complexity. Distinct local, Hohokam, Pueblo, and other signatures are discernible through ceramic typologies, habitation practices, and other types of remains, making for highly visible social changes, especially when compared to other parts of the northern Southwest. Unlike the northern Rio Grande, where migrants appear to quickly integrate into existing communities and little material trace of their migration remains, in the Verde Valley, we are able to see a widespread shift in material culture, traditions, and population movement. So are we then to say that the Southern Sonawa were Hohokam people who became ancestral Puebloan people as they adopted Pueblos and other material signatures related to northern Southwest cultures? To me, the notion of material remains assigned to a group does not indicate that people belong to that group. This seems like an injustice to the ancient people we study and the complex social lives they led. In the Verde Valley and other periphery areas, we get hints of these complexities in the material record, but these complexities do not fit neatly within our taxonomic classification systems. Thus, in archaeological descriptions, ancient people are shaped and simplified to fit within pre-existing traditions or cultures. Through this process, we lose the subtleties that make history interesting to explore, and most importantly, we lose sight of the humanity of the people we study. Modern descendants of ancestral Puebloan people have consistently advocated for archaeologists to take a more humanized perspective on the past, perhaps most prominently through NAGPRA. There is absolutely still a need to organize ancient peoples if we are to study the past in a systematic way. But there must be ways to adapt our current frameworks to highlight complexities and bring forth people's humanities. This complexity and humanity is hard to fit onto a site form where everything must fit into predetermined categories and checkboxes. I don't have an answer or a golden ticket for how to change our current system, but I know that if we do not question the underlying assumptions that frame our scientific inquiry, we are apt to fall into complacency and limit our understanding of the past. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Andy. That concludes the first 2/3, I guess, of our of the conference here. And I don't see any questions in the Q&A function here for the last three, but I just want to ask if anybody else has any questions here for the last three panelists. I will take that as a no. Okay. Well, we'll go ahead and take a lunch break.
Kyle, it looks like we do have a question from Kathy Hensler. She's raised her hand.
Okay.
So, Kathy, we'll go ahead and give you an option to unmute yourself. One moment. Okay, Kathy.
Yeah, I just a question for Mr. Larson here. Having worked in the Salado area, I'm just curious, how do patterns of warfare play out in the southern Kanawha compared to the Salado area? And is that something that's kind of universal for northern and southern Kanawha, or is there a difference in that pattern? It's, you know, it was something that was a big deal for the Salado, so just curious about that.
Yeah, thanks, Kathy. You know, I don't know a lot about the Salado, but I would say that kind of potential for warfare among the southern Kanawha and Hohokam seemed to be one possible reason why that kind of alliance happened, or that shift sort of occurred. And so to answer your question, I'm not too sure about the Salado. Sorry.
Okay.
Thank you, Kathy. Do we have any other questions for the last three panelists? Okay. Well, let's take a lunch break and we'll stay basically on schedule. And if everybody wants to return around 1:15 p.m., we'll see you guys then. Thank you. Okay, everyone, welcome back. Our next talk here is by Jim Raley with his presentation, Pithouses Through Time and Space in the Albuquerque Basin and Southwest Margin of the Greater Four Corners region. Jim?
Okay, can you hear me?
Hear you and see you.
You can hear me and see me. Okay. All right. So somehow I clicked something in my, okay, I'm going to cancel to leave the meeting. Okay. For some reason, the Zoom, okay, I'm going to start screen sharing. Can you see my screen?
Yep, I got it.
And you can see, am I in, okay, so slide from the beginning. Okay, there we go. All right. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about pit houses in the Albuquerque Basin and southwest margin of the Greater Four Corners region, just like it says there on my slide. And the study was, and well, here I'm kind of summarizing an analysis and a report chapter that I did as part of SWCA's data recovery at several sites along New Mexico 6 for the New Mexico DOT. And this study was prompted by the discovery and excavation of 4 small pit houses at LA 72301 which is right here along the Rio San Jose, just south of the New Mexico 6 and I-40 interchange. And before I proceed, I need to give a big shout out here to Megan Trowbridge, who directed and managed this project. She did a really outstanding job doing so, and I was really just one of the helpers. So as part of this project, start my video. Okay, there we go. Okay. Okay, so we were curious to know how these four structures relate to Pithouse patterns and trends in the site's geographic surroundings. Okay, there we are. And okay, let me go back. Okay, so and this was of special interest because our site lies along a, I think I got. Yeah, here we go. This was of special interest because our site lies along a frontier of sorts between the Greater Four Corners region to the west and the Northern Rio Grande Valley to the east. And these two areas have rather divergent cultural histories, as most of us here know, especially during the ceramic time frame after about AD 400 or so. And these differences are summed up nicely by a couple of Steves, that is Lakatos and Post, in their chapter in a nice book on southwestern Pithouse communities. And what they wrote says it as well or better than I could, so I'll just read their quote. In the Northern Rio Grande, long-term stability contrasts with contemporaneous communities to the west that continually refined, enhanced, or replaced architectural styles and other forms of cultural material. And this is certainly true for the pre-8900 time span that they looked at. But in my study here, I lengthened the time span out beyond 8900 to look at pit houses all the way through to the end. So I started by defining a study area that's oriented mostly east-west, from along the Rio Grande on the east to the San Mateo Basin and Acoma areas at the west end, so over on either side of Grants. And being centered on our site, this area spans the boundary between the Northern Rio Grande and the Greater Four Corners region. All right, so anyway, in this study area, I tracked down and collected data for 132 ceramic period pit houses at 54 sites, and I got my info from 34 document sources. And my data set has 47 columns of attributes and other information. Now, I probably did not round up and corral every pit house. In fact, I know I didn't within the study area, but I caught most of them. And anyway, it was a pretty good sample size to run with. Now, not surprisingly, the quality of data reporting varies considerably between the document sources. So, as you might expect, the older reports and articles in general are a bit sketchier and less detailed than more recent ones, and so some of the attributes I examined couldn't be recorded for all pit houses in the data set. So here, let's look at the sites broken out by geography. And here we see that most of them are in the Albuquerque Basin, which is part of the Northern Rio Grande region. And looking at pit house numbers by time period, we see that most of them date early in the ceramic time frame. And here I standardize things using the Pecos classification periods, and you'll also notice some overlap between the period designations down there on the x-axis labels. And this has to do with the nature of the temporal evidence from each site, which is based primarily on ceramics. So you have some overlap, period overlap in the ceramics, but also C14 dates. So looking at these temporal trends by geography, here's where things really start to get interesting. First, we see a big drop in the number of pit houses in the Albuquerque Basin after that initial Basket Maker 3 to P1 interval. Meanwhile, to the west, there's a bit of a bump during the P2 to 3 interval, and after which the numbers here over in the west drop to 0 in the P3 only and P4 periods. And this trend over in the west probably relates to changes in settlement and community patterns from the Chaco to post-Chaco time periods. So in Chaco times, there were rather dispersed communities that included pit structures, and at least some of these communities were linked to outlier great houses. But in later P3 times, post-Chaco, most people moved into more aggregated pueblos in the Greater Four Corners region. And then, of course, there was widespread abandonment of this region at the end of P3. So these trends probably help explain this disappearance of pit houses that we see over here in the West. But I do need to point out something about our 4 project pit houses. Now I've placed them in this P2 to 3 bin because they have ceramics from both periods. But the radiocarbon dates are actually very late, and taken together, the evidence suggests these houses were probably occupied very late in P3. So I could just as easily have moved them over into this P3 only interval. And as such, they kind of buck the trend over in the western part of the study area. And that's a point I'll get back to here shortly toward the end of the paper. Okay, next up is pit house size. And here we see that most of them are between 2 and 5 meters in diameter. And looking at pit house size over time, we see that they get smaller. And in the earliest temporal interval, we see a really wide range in size, including the largest structure in the data set. But keep in mind, this interval also has the highest number of pit houses, or about half of the entire data set. So it's not necessarily all that surprising that we also have the greatest variation in pit house size during this interval. Still, this pattern may have some meaning with respect to trends over time. So let's talk a little bit more about that and see how things played out between the eastern and western parts of the study area. Looking at the eastern part, we see that pit houses got a lot smaller after P2. That is during the late developmental and into the coalition and classic periods, if we were to use the Northern Rio Grande sequence terminology or period names. There's also somewhat of a change in pit house shape here, from round, oval, and D-shaped forms early on to more squared and rectangular ones later in the sequence. And this trend is something that's also evident in other parts of the Southwest. So anyway, in the Albuquerque Basin, pit house communities were the norm early on, with lots of them in the Basket Maker 3 to P1 interval. And these are rather dispersed communities, albeit with a lot of household clustering. And sprinkled among these, the rank and file pit houses in the Albuquerque Basin are some really supersized structures that were probably some sort of communal or public facilities. And this is also similar to what we see in many early pit house period settlements and communities in the greater Four Corners region and down in the Members area and beyond, where there are big houses here and there among the more numerous and smaller rank and file ones. Okay, so as we've already seen, there are not only fewer pit houses in the Albuquerque Basin after P2, that is toward the end of the late developmental period of the Rio Grande sequence, but they also get much smaller on average. And a lot of these later structures are simply too small to fit more than 1 or 2 people inside them comfortably, and some of them lack interior hearths. So not only do these structures get smaller, but it looks like many of them here late in time were probably used for storage, ritual activity, or other non-domestic or specialized activities. Now, this also happens at the same time that we start seeing more and more surface structures in the Northern Rio Grande. And as a lot of us know, these started out here as rather modest jacals, but were followed by larger room blocks in the coalition period, and then, of course, the supersized adobe pueblos of the classic period. Meanwhile, let's go west now. Pit structure patterns play out in ways that are both similar to and different from what we see in the Albuquerque Basin. And here we find pit houses that look like those in the Albuquerque Basin. A lot of the same features, shapes and features and ventilators and that sort of thing. But unlike the Albuquerque Basin, they don't get smaller over time over here in the West, although to be fair, they're not there in the West anymore by late P3 time, so it's not really an apples to orange comparison between the two areas. But there are some really noticeable differences as well. One of the most obvious is the use of architectural stone. For example, things like slab-lined hearths, masonry facing, and stone deflectors are found over here in the West, but not to the east in the Rio Grande Valley. And of course, there are also above-ground masonry room blocks, which appear in the western part of our study area as early as P1, and these commonly co-occur here with pit structures. And we even have some Chaco and grate houses straying into the western part of our study area, something we obviously don't have in the Rio Grande Valley. Now, people over here in the West were using construction stone in part because it was naturally available and plentiful, whereas in the Albuquerque Basin, it's mostly lacking. The Albuquerque Basin is mostly lacking in this stone building material. So geology itself at least partially explains this rather prominent east-west difference in our study area. As for the pit structures themselves, we also see a real diversification in form and function over in the west. This includes some various shaped pit houses, mealing and storage rooms, and the so-called keyhole-shaped kivas, which are the real stars of the show among the pit houses over here in the west. And we saw some keyhole-shaped structures in an earlier talk. And these are not only really distinctive, but they're also fairly common in the greater Four Corners region. And in our study area, they're found in the San Mateo Basin and to some distance eastward down the Rio San Jose, but their range stops short of the Albuquerque Basin. So I'm going to wrap things up here by looking at how pit houses from our project site fit into these broader patterns and trends. And I'll start here with a spoiler alert by saying that overall, the evidence points east. Now, remember that I was just talking about this, even though I placed our site and its pit houses in the P2/3 interval, pottery from the site suggests its occupation did not begin prior to AD 1000 and lasted up until around or shortly after 1300. But our radiocarbon dates actually range from late in this time span, the ceramic time span from the site, up to around 1400. That is post-dating some or all of the ceramic types recovered from the site. And when I became aware of this disconnect between the ceramics and a lot of the radiocarbon dates, I was really glad at that point that the buck didn't stop with me on this project, and I wished Megan the best of luck and in trying to explain that away. But anyway, whoops, got ahead of myself. But anyway, there aren't any glazewares from the site, so it looks like the occupation here didn't extend very far beyond 1300, if at all. So taken together, it looks like our pit houses at the site were probably built and used during P3 and probably in late P3. And as we've seen, this was a time when pit houses are mostly gone from the western part of our study area, yet they persist in the Albuquerque Basin to the east, and they also get much smaller, both of which are consistent with our pit houses at the project site. Our structures are small, at least one of them are square, and this is consistent with them being late in time. Now, the pottery types from the site include both Greater Four Corners and Rio Grande wares, but overall the ceramics suggest closer ties to the Rio Grande. We also found no evidence of above ground architecture at the site, masonry or otherwise, so it may have hosted a pit house only settlement. But these structures are really small, and if they were day-to-day domiciles, then individual family members may have been split up between them. There may also have been some Hakal surface dwellings at the site that just didn't leave any discernible evidence, or were previously destroyed by the road, or whose remains are still out there but were just outside of our project corridor. But any which way you cut it, the very presence of these little pit structures at this site and the dating of the site late in time is much more consistent with what's going on in the late developmental and coalition periods of the Rio Grande Valley than in the late P3 of the Greater Four Corners region. So to conclude, since I'm already out on a limb, I'll just go ahead out to the end of it and suggest that our site's late P3 component may be a little colonizing occupation by short distance migrants coming in from the Albuquerque Basin or somewhere along the Rio Grande to the east. And if so, this group may have moved into an area that had already been vacated by its previous occupants. And that's it, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Jim. Really interesting. So our next panelist is Ron Fields, who will be talking to us about ballistic technology change and appearance of stockaded hamlets and villages in the American Southwest.
All right, can everybody see me now? Hello, anybody there?
We're here.
Yeah, we can see you, Ron. You are muted, Ron.
Ron, you're muted.
All right, can everybody see me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? And can you see my screen?
Yep, we see it on the PowerPoint if you want to put it in presentation mode.
Perfect.
Perfect.
Okay, so pretty much what I want to do is start out saying that this is kind of a slowly developing project that I've done since I've been in the Southwest, but working for other parks back east, I have a lot of experience with stockaded villages, and so does Jim Raley. But also a lot of my interest stems with ballistic technological change. And the Pithouse to Pueblo tradition is iconic for that period in time. Here you can see at the very beginning, Hibben has a picture of a Kiva mural, and it shows a warrior who has these hooked sticks, and he thinks that that warrior actually has atlatls. It's funny that when I was looking at this collection down in the inner sanctum there, one person was working with something that they thought was a pendant, but I believe it was actually an atlatl weight. And here you can see it's out of hematite. Basically, what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to run through really quick because I have so many slides. The Southwest, just briefly, very briefly, ballistic technologies, a ritual practice, basically shrines with votive offerings in New Mexico. I'm going to talk about Wahinak Shakuka Shatawatawa, which is a Laguna shrine, also known as Carrillo Cave. Jim actually had a map and it showed that particular locality, so that was really cool. Also, I'm going to talk about the Carrillo Cave radiocarbon results, the ballistic technologies from there, the ballistic technological change in the Southwest. I'm going to talk about basket maker big men, possibly big women, and war chiefs associated with flutes, atlals, and atlatl darts, and probably trophy heads and scalps. I'm going to also talk about stockades, advantages of the Pithouse, the passive concept, the active concept, when things actually go horribly wrong. And then the timing of some of these big deep pit houses in association with horticulture and agriculture and bow and arrow technology. And why didn't stockades continue? All right, I'm not going to spend much time here, but this is the Southwest, and a lot of the places that I'm going to talk about, if you're interested, you can go back to this later. And some of them may not be on here, but let me know and I can help you to find them later. The two competing technologies is atlatl and dart and bow and arrow. And here you can see a codex showing two of these people facing off, one with an eagle mask and also one with jaguar. So here you can see the two in Mesoamerica. Rarely do you ever get to see what the technology is, but in what I call the type 4 dart, which is a socketed dart, has a lot of different tools or foreshafts that actually insert into the socket. But these people also would have been using the throwing stick to hook into the very back of the spear and catapult that spear. They also used a curved flat stick, possibly as a fending stick. As time goes on, possibly as early as 100 AD in the Southwest, we see the self-bow possibly coming in. My research is showing certainly about 500 at present. But later on, about 1250 AD, we may have the recurve bow appearing with either a NMAC or Athabascan groups. The types of arrows could be a solid shaft, which is the self arrow, or you have compound, which is a piece of hardwood for the foreshaft, and a Phragmites as the main shaft. Now, how do we know a lot about these different types of artifacts? We don't know a lot. What we do know is that we find them oftentimes pushed in the caves and cracks and crevices as offerings. Here's a number of places throughout New Mexico that actually have had some of these materials. Here you can see U-Bar Cave. Lambert and Amber shows a picture of these arrows stuck into where a stalagmite is. The same way with the Arrow Grotto, a feather cave that was found in the 60s. Now, one particular cave, Carrillo Cave, just found outside of Albuquerque. Like I said, Jim actually had a picture of it. We have Elsie Cluse Parsons went in there in 1918, and she shows that there's a whole bunch of materials from spear shafts, arrow shafts, curved sticks, and also prayer sticks. Her report talks about a pin cushion of arrows that the informant told her existed before she got there. But a little bit later on in time, and I'm going to go right there shortly, Siegfried Sandberg, who works for UNM, or worked for UNM, their field school in 1949, actually in his excavations found a bunch of spear shafts kind of in the same fashion as the arrows. So in 1949, here you can see Siegfried Sandberg, all of the different crew folks. Annie Willis gave me this, and she's the second from the right. That was her drawing, and also she gave me this photograph too. This is basically a cone, and it's a travertine cone, and it basically it's very shallow on the surface, only about 5 meters by 11 meters for the entrance. It's only about 7 meters above the plane, but it drops down to at least 11 meters deep. And here you can see some of their excavation units. I was turned on to this collection by Dr. Phil Geib and his quest to look at flat curved sticks. And these are oftentimes associated with this technology. And he was wanting to find out, are these, rabbit sticks, or are they actually for killing, for almost like shields? Anyway, when I looked at that material, I started looking at Sandberg's notes and his master's thesis, and here you can see a technological change that he witnessed, and that's what turned me onto this collection. The problem is that, yeah, we have a technological change, but we don't know when it happened, no chronological dates, and we have mixed deposits. So I went ahead and obtained a couple of grants, one from NMAC and one from Albright Worth, and these are the radiocarbon dates that you see before you that I was able to obtain. This is an atlatl from the collection. I just wanted to share that with you. 4 different types of spears were found in this, which the radiocarbon bears out where they come in time. These are the same different types of spears, different breakouts based off of their ends. Feel free to look at those later. And the crests that I found on them, these are the foreshafts that would have been stuck into those, and we have a radiocarbon dates from them. The stone points, what we find is a number of San Pedros, and then as far as that's for the darts, for the arrows, it's more of a corner notched types. And here you can see what looks like a breakout about AD 500. And these are the arrow foreshafts. Looking at the diameters, this gives you a breakout in diameters for arrows to help you out in the field. Same way I correlated that with point types to see what ones would lend themselves to the same shaft diameters with known types. And this is a breakout in color showing dart, which is red. We have basically a technological shift around AD 500, and then we have arrows. Unfortunately, I only have 4 arrows. We need a lot more sample size. But this basically shows you a tradition existed and went through time. And you had the S-shaped curved stick with these darts, but as time goes on, that S-shaped curved stick turns into a C-shaped club. at Ebo, we have what may be a scene that I discovered with an atlatl person throwing the dart into a shield of someone holding a bow. Looking at looking at atlatl persistence and bow adoption, you can see people look at it by points, by the shafts, or by a mixed analysis. Feel free to look at that in the future. But as you can see, it's not just one cut, dry answer. Some actually use stone points and think these points were very early and may have actually been developed here. In particular, Sliva, actually, she's pushing that these points start with Cienega and San Pedro's, and then they slowly develop those and migrate out, either from Mexico or from Arizona out. But Phil Geib and Bungart, they believe that Rosegate corner notch is coming in with the Fremont. So those are two competing ideas. Now I want to direct our attention to big men and big women. This individual here was found at Seahatzo, or Big Cave in Canyon del Muerto. And these are 4 atlals I was able to examine thanks to Dr. Lexon. And these are quite different. They're in pairs, and this individual was treated uniquely. And what I mean is lots of grave goods. He had 4 flutes, 4 atlals, 4 sandals, and I can go on and on. Another similar big man was in Broken Flute Cave, and this individual probably was killed because he had a blunt force trauma to the head. He was also found with 2 flutes. And why I say flutes are important is they're tied to love, they're tied to war. You look at Laguna and Zuni and Hopi and all these pueblos, and they're often associated with war or some form of that. Even the Apache have a concept of that too. Now, looking at basket maker Palisades, Roan, Wilcox, and Haas think that pretty much from B3, throughout Pueblo, settlements had these stockades. A lot of the current thinking is they keep children, dogs, and turkeys inside. They're windbreak, hamlets. It's a boundary. It's a defining of sacred space, defense against bow and arrow, slows down aggressors, so on and so forth, keeps animals out. My argument is you know what? The archaic had children, they had dogs, they had turkeys, all that, and they didn't have these things. Why? Well, here you can see Roan excavated at the Jillian site in Colorado, and here you can see the stockade going all the way around in very massive posts. Here are a number of others from Yellow Jacket in southwest Colorado. Again, here's one that was found by Murrell and Vieira recently, and here you can see that. But when you start plotting them in time, they break out pretty much in the known use of bow and arrow technology. They're not during the dart period. Looking now at the pit house itself, we think of pit houses through the passive concept. They keep breeze out, they're cooler in the hot days in the summer and warmer in the winter. They afford privacy. It's a place that pretty much you can grind stuff and wind ain't going to blow it in. You can safeguard your foodstuffs. But there's also an active concept that I like to play on, and that's pit houses they're also difficult to locate behind a stockade. They're somewhat impervious to attack. You can seal up the entrance and you're safe. Hopefully, if somebody shoots at you, it's pretty impermeable to arrows. Now, tied to that, there was a governor that was talking about the Chickasaw, and he was talking about their palisaded fort at Akia in 1733 or 36, fairly late in time. But he says they dig holes inside in order to hide themselves up to their shoulders, and they fire through loopholes. And that gives you an idea that, some of these so-called storage pits outside of these things, these extramural features actually might have been used for archers protecting these things. They also say that the covering of the cabins is of a wall of earth and wood, proof against burning arrows and grenades, so that nothing but bombs can hurt them. Okay, so this is pretty much what I think, is that some of these extramural features could be for archer pits. We'll never know. We can never prove it probably, but Let's keep that in mind. They may be strategically placed. Pit houses may have served as passive dwellings, but they also could serve as bunkers. You know, you can seal it up, but you might have had those loopholes, just like you see right here. Things sometimes can go wrong. You know, people come in and they conquer you. Here we have cannibalism going on in around 1150 AD, just outside Mesa Verde. We find evidence of that in 2 pit houses right here. And this gives you an idea of pretty much where they fit. You see that in time, you have big, deep pit houses appear, and then you have these stockades appear. Right about and they're all correlated also with bow, and I'm sure with, you know, sedentism, and I'm sure with agriculture and a lot of other things, but that's food for thought. Moving a little bit more in time, it gives you an idea, you know, of where it fits and everything else with the feuding, raiding, resource unpredictability. Okay, now you have stockades. I'm looking at this as an ethnographic example, where an archaeological example, where in the east you see that stockades start rising. But why don't we have that going on here? Well, you know, LeBlanc and others, you know, have brought up this concept of maybe it's the architecture. You know, they're building these stair steps going up, or, you know, honeycomb structures. Here on the right-hand side, you can see the early form of the circular construct at Gran Cavera. But as time goes on, they replace that with a honeycomb on top of it. And that circular pattern in the very beginning might actually be tied to that concept of stockadism, is what I'll call it, where they're making these circular stockades and then later on replacing them with actual architecture. So pretty much what can I say? In conclusion, ritual votive offering practices existed amongst the archaic and persisted to the modern Pueblo today. Korea may show a dart to arrow shift around 500, but the Southwest is somewhat variable, I'm sure. There's probably big men and big women that exist that may have served as war chiefs. How we possibly know that is based off of atlatls, darts, trophy heads, scalps, and flutes. We know that pit houses get deeper and may have served as bunkers and breastworks, and sometimes things go bad. With pit houses becoming deeper, they're contemporaneous a lot of times with that bow and arrow technology. And try using a bow and arrow, it's perfect in a pit house. Try using an atlatl in that same confined space, it's impossible. Anyway, I think that's pretty much it, and thank you for having me. I would like to say thank you to the Pueblo of Laguna and NMAC, and also the Albright Worth Grant Committee and others. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ron. So our last presentation today is by Rebecca Wells, Ken Brown, Matt Leister, and Sandra Brantley. And their presentation is entitled Mud Daubers, Spiders, and Abandonment at LA 112420, an early developmental pit structure in Sandoval County, New Mexico.
Yep. No, that's good. You're muted. Can you hear me? I got my mute off.
Nope, we can hear you, Ken.
You can hear me. Okay. Thank you very much. Well, I'd like you to start. The New Mexico Department of Transportation contracted with TRC Environmental Corporation to conduct data recovery at LA 112420 during July and August of 2017 for a highway improvement project on the west side of the bridge crossing the Rio Grande in Bernalillo. Have the next slide there. Shows the location. It's just south of the Coronado State Monument Site and west of the Rio Grande Bridge. Work was funded by the Federal Highway Administration and the New Mexico Department of Transportation. We want to give special thanks to Blake Roxlow, Steve Lakatos, and Gwyneth Duncan. The following discussion focuses on two unusual findings from the site. First, the recovery of a burned mud dauber's nest and its implications regarding dating the site and determining seasonality when the pit structure burned. And second, the abandonment and subsequent ceremonial burning of the pit structure. I will be discussing the former, and Rebecca Wells will be discussing the latter. So to begin with, regarding the mud dauber's nest, just a fair warning here. If anyone in the audience has either spexophobia or arachnophobia, this is your time to get out of the Zoom meeting here. Just a stupid joke. Okay. The site had been previously documented during several surveys as a surface artifact scatter and 2 thermal features. Upon excavate, and if you look at the picture on the right here, the green area is the pit structure, what turned into be the pit structure, and showing the location of features 1 and 2 that were originally recorded during surveys. Excavation of the 2 features ended up finding that it was, they merged and they turned into a single pit house. The next slide. And got the next slide there? Yeah, okay. And the burned roof fall, as indicated on the right there, you can see all the burned adobe and ash charcoal, contained a burned mud dauber's nest in study unit 35, which is, if you can see my little arrow, just to the couple of meters to the left of the yellow unit 37 there. The nest, next slide, the mud dauber's nest was recovered from the roof fall, and it was collected by TRC and returned to our laboratory. One of our biologists was examining it and opened one of the cells, and in one of the cells were preserved spiders. And so finding this, next slide, the TRC team realized that there were cultural implications. So we contacted the entomologists and the anthropod division at the Museum of Southwestern Biology at the University of New Mexico. Graduate student Matthew Leister and Dr. Sandra Brantley examined the contents from the cell and got permission to open the other 3 remaining cells, which contained well-preserved carbonized spiders. I'd just like to point out on these spiders, if you look at the one on the left here, you can, the 5 millimeters, so we're talking very small spiders here. And if you look, the preservation is exceptional. You can still see the hairs, the body hairs on the legs of the spiders. Matthew Leister determined upon examination of the spiders from all of the cells that there were 26 distinct spiders within the 3 sealed cells. Okay, the next slide. Of the 26 spiders, 10 were identified as crab spiders, 8 as cobweb weavers or comb-footed spiders. 1 was an orb weaver spider, 1 as a running crab spider, and 6 were simply could only be identified as being spiders. Amazingly, gender was able to be determined for 8 or 9 of them, consisting of 7 males, 1 possible female, and a female with eggs. Can I have the next slide? If you look on this one up here at the top, you'll see some little balls, black balls in the middle. Those are the eggs of the spider that were laid after the spider had been packed into the cell by the mud dauber. Unfortunately, all of the identified spider families have numerous genera and species that inhabit a wide range of environments commonly occurring in the vicinity of LA 112420. One charged spider was submitted to Beta Analytic, next slide showing the photo taken by Beta Analytic on the left there, and was submitted for AMS dating. I might add that when we submitted the spider to Beta Analytic, they were rather very excited. I don't think they'd ever dated a charred spider before from archaeological context. The spider produced a calibrated date of AD 684 to 780 or 787 to 876, as summarized in the table on the right. These dates are similar to those obtained from burned Z maize samples recovered from the pit structure. These dates place the burning of the pit structure within the early developmental period, AD 600 to 900, which is further supported by the ceramics and projectile point assemblages and pit house construction techniques. Mike Marshall of Siebler Research Consultants did the ceramic analysis. When this project began, I knew absolutely nothing regarding the life cycle of mud daubers. Next slide there, please. And I still don't know very much. However, I'd like to discuss their life cycle a little bit here because it concerns the seasonality of when the pit structure burned. However, I'd like to warn you that the following description could come from Edgar Allan Poe. The recovered mud dauber's nest is most likely attributed to one of two mud dauber species, as shown in the next slide. The black and yellow mud dauber or the blue mud dauber, and the latter of which tends to reuse nests built by other species. Both are non-aggressive and are common in a wide variety of habitats throughout much of the United States. Adult mud daubers feed on nectar and are active from spring through fall, usually mating in the spring or early summer, building their nest in the late summer or early fall and hibernating during the cooler months. Show the next slide. The female working by herself, the males are lazy. What else is new, guys? All right. Makes a nest in a sheltered location. The nest consists of several parallel cylindrical mud cells, each requiring 30 to 40 trips to gather enough mud from a nearby source to construct the cell. The construction of the nest within the pit structure means clayey mud was readily available and probably closer than today's Rio Grande, which is presently located 250 meters east of the site. Steve Hall, the project geomorphologist, identified clay lenses in the site's backhoe trenches that revealed that the pit structure was built on the banks of an ephemeral stream that would have provided a source of water and clay during the rainy season. Once the cells are constructed, the female wasp hunts spiders, which she stings to paralyze and brings them to the nest alive. She stuffs the first spider into an open cell and lays an egg on it. She continues to pack the cell with spiders one at a time, usually 3 to 9 spiders per cell, before sealing it with mud. She abandons the nest once all the cells are provisioned and sealed. After the eggs hatch, the carnivorous larvae feed on the paralyzed spiders, which are still alive until they have been completely consumed. Even Edgar Allan Poe couldn't think of that, huh? The larvae in the individual cells then spin cocoons and spend the winter as pupae. In the spring, they emerge by chewing their way out of the nest. Under normal circumstances, the time between the provisioning of the cell and the final consumption of the spiders by the larvae can be 10 days to 3 weeks. The presence of the spiders in the nest recovered from the pit house suggests the pit structure burned sometime during the late summer or early fall, soon after the nest was complete, but before or just after the wasp eggs had hatched. There were no mud dauber eggs, larvae, or pupae identified amongst the charred cell contents, but the spiders were still all intact. Since the spiders are eaten alive, we wish to point out that their carbon-14 isotope had not yet begun to decay until the pit structure fire killed them. Therefore, the AMS date obtained from the spider represents the most accurate date for the burning of the pit structure. as borrowing from Rebecca, those spiders were doomed either by being eaten or buried alive, or burned alive, burned alive out of the frying pan into the fire. So why do the burned spiders date the end of the occupation of the pit structure? Next slide. Rebecca Wells will continue with the abandonment at LA 2011-24-20. Rebecca, it's yours.
All right. Thanks, Ken. Okay, so to answer Ken's question about why we assume that the burned spiders date the end of the occupation, the key can be found in the patterns of abandonment identified among ancestral Puebloan and Mimbres sites in the Southwest. Abandonment generally entails either burning a structure, dismantling of the roof so that it collapses on the floor, sometimes with individuals buried within, or allowing the structure to collapse naturally. In the first two strategies, the roof would collapse directly onto the floor with no other fill deposits between them, suggesting that virtually no time will elapse between the final use of the building and its retirement. Next slide, please. Several experiments on replica Puebloan pit structures in the Dolores area in southwestern Colorado, Hohokam thatch pit structures, and an earth lodge building in North Dakota have shown that earthen structures are more difficult to start on fire than wooden or thatched structures, but once they caught fire, they burned quickly. Samples of structures studied in the Southwest show that roughly half of the structures were burned upon abandonment and half were not, often independent of the presumed function of the structures. The frequency of burned habitation structures at San Marcial phase sites in the Middle Rio Grande region, of which LA 112420 is one, seems inordinate for accidental cause, though of course some of them may have been incidental. Other structures were possibly intentionally burned as a matter of closure, perhaps by groups attempting to prevent resettlement of the abandoned sites or dwellings. Ethnographic accounts indicate that the abandonment of earthen and timber structures is common after a relatively short period of time, roughly 10 to 15 years, for various reasons, such as deterioration of the materials, insect infestation, death or disease, internal social factors, or environmental pressures. Abandonment of individual structures within a settlement is evidenced by continued habitation close by, use of abandoned structures as a repository for refuse, and/or scavenging of large roof beams or support posts to be used in new construction nearby. Feature 3 seems to demonstrate two of these three observations. There are similar constructions that were discovered at Las Quemadas site, 400 meters to the northwest, and the large central posts were missing from the structure, probably to be reused elsewhere. Next slide, please. Construction technique and lack of plastering or remodeling suggest a short duration of occupation of feature 3 at LA 112420. The architectural features are simple and imply a domestic use with no evidence of more complex elements of community-wide ritual structures or so-called proto-kivas. While Richard Wilshusen found a correlation between higher-level ritual architectural features such as central vaults and burning upon abandonment in the Dolores area, Catherine Cameron did not find a similar scenario among a larger sample of the Four Corner sites. She did, however, find a statistically significant correlation between the presence of whole or restorable pots on the floor and burning upon abandonment. Unfortunately, we were unable to test Cameron's hypothesis at the site since most of the ceramics were highly fragmented due to post-depositional disturbance. A notable exception was one worked lino gray sherd that was embedded on the floor, and it likely served as a pot rest. Next slide, please. Yet some of the items, such as a ceramic pipe and a few pallets, were found among in the burned roof fill and may represent dedicatory offerings incorporated into the fabric of the architecture, a phenomenon reported by Daryl Creel and Roger Anion in communal pit structures in the Mimbres region, and which has also been observed in Chaco and Great Kivas and Hopi Kivas. There were also 3 small boulders or large cobbles encountered on the occupational surface outside of the pit structure, just to the north, to the east, and to the west. Unfortunately, the south edge was already highly disturbed by buried utility lines and highway construction, so we don't know if there was one on that side too. The purpose of these unworked rocks is unknown, but may represent the marking of cardinal directions, which Paul Reed told me by phone is a Tiwa tradition. Another ritual is the intentional placement of objects within the structure that were burned upon retirement. This pattern, which culminated in the early AD 900s among the Mimbres people, may provide insight into a small cache of items that was found on the floor of feature 3. Can I have the next slide, please? 2 metates, a mano, and an obsidian projectile point were found stacked on top of each other on the floor between the hearth and the entrance at the southeast edge of the pit house. Next slide. Other objects were found in the immediate vicinity as well, including a chert projectile point that was reworked into a knife, a few decorated ceramic sherds, and there weren't that many decorated ceramic sherds from the assemblage, and 3 chert and chalcedony scraper tools. Objects such as grinding slabs, pipes, stone bowls, pottery vessels, and projectile points were often deliberately placed within buildings in the Mimbres Valley as dedicatory or retirement offerings, often near the entry. This was not a common location for grinding elements in most habitation structures in the Middle Rio Grande region. They were most often located in spaces that Matt Schmader identified as the maintained interior space and or activity area that was usually located behind the hearth on the opposite side of the entry. Next slide, please. The presence and location of the stacked artifacts at LA 112420, plus the collapsed roof lying directly on the sandy floor, suggest a closing ceremony that resembles the intentional burning and abandonment ritual observed among some Mimbres pit structures. The floor and near floor assemblages are sparse compared to hastily departed structures or ones that collapsed while effectively sealing in situ activity areas. The interpretation of feature 3 is that most items had been cleared out prior to abandonment, and those that remain stand out as possibly significant either by their artifact type or their position within the structure. In summary, the burning of the structure at LA 112420 captured a rare moment in time. Because of the small window in which spiders are present within a mud dauber's nest before they are eaten, this lucky find provided the unique ability to place a cultural phenomenon, that is, the intentional burning and ritual surrounding the abandonment of the pit structure, within a temporal and seasonal context by virtue of a natural phenomenon, the provisioning of a mud dauber nest. The burned spiders provided the broader time period via the radiocarbon date, and then the knowledge of the wasp's life cycle and nest building techniques helped narrow down the season of abandonment to the wetter late summer or early fall. Next slide, please. Oops, sorry. There you go. Thank you. We will likely never know the reason that the structure was abandoned in the first place, whether it had to do with environmental or societal stresses, conflict, disease, insect infestation, deterioration of construction materials, or any other of the reasons posited for intrasite structure abandonment. Nevertheless, the presence of certain preserved artifacts found on the floor and among the floor and fill assemblages suggests that some special ceremony was likely associated with the abandonment. This ritual appears to have involved placement of objects in meaningful locations and intentional burnings to retire the structure. All right, next slide now. So this project was provided the opportunity for a rewarding collaboration between the fields of archaeology and entomology. We'd like to thank our co-authors at UNM, and then also express our appreciation for the funding made possible by NMDOT and FWHA that allowed us to be part of this unique research opportunity. Thanks also to everyone at Coronado Historical Site and Museum of Indian Arts and Culture for your help and support, and to the field crew for all your hard work. Next slide. And then this report is available online. The website on the screen is not quite right. I think the URL has changed since then. But if you look up NMDOT Environmental Bureau Publications, you'll still find it. It's still available online. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Rebecca. I haven't seen any questions in the Q&A feature here, so I just want to give a minute here if anybody had any questions concerning Ken and Rebecca's talk or anything from Ron or Jim before we wrap up here. Bueller? No? Okay. Well, I'd like to thank everybody who participated today and gave the wonderful presentations. And I'd like to thank everybody who also showed up to the conference. You know, we got roughly the same amount of attendance that we usually do at these things, even though we held it online. So thanks again for all your support for NMAC. And if there's nothing else, then you guys have a great rest of your day.